Dear boomers, has the psychedelic experience had any influence on you? Have you taken the drug, which would be LSD, the psychedelics of mushrooms, ayahuasca, and there's other weird and interesting psychedelics in the form of a toad, for instance. Have you ever had these things happen to you, and how has it affected your life today? I've been reading this great book, this Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, written by Timothy Leary, Richard Albert, and Ralph Metzger. And what they do is parallel the psychedelic experience with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And as I recall, many times, my generation would sit with people who were dying, maybe their parents, friends or whatever, and read the actual Tibetan Book of the Dead. This this book does really have the Tibetan Book of the Dead in it, but I was just concentrating on the introduction. We talk about the sudden influx of the experience of psychedelics in the end of 1950s and early 60s. And what happened was Timothy Leary and Richard Albert were experimenting with psychedelics. They started out with psilocybin, and Timothy Leary said he took his first psilocybin experience in Mexico, and he said what he learned in that 12-hour experience was, and it was even more intense for him than all of his years of schooling. And then they set out to change the world with their tune in, turn on, drop out philosophy, which was not very happy for our parents. They didn't like Timothy Leary. I don't think they knew much about Richard Albert, who had by then gone to India and procured a wonderful guru by the name of Amin Krili Baba. And there's nobody like that guy. He changed everything. I even gave him 5 hits of LSD, and it didn't affect him at all. So then, we had this LSD insurgence because of these 2 men, really, and it abruptly end with Woodstock and then Altamont, there was violence there. Woodstock was a very traumatic experience for everybody because it rained so hard that people were, trudging through mud and they were, but it didn't bother people because they were all high on LSD. And then we had the Students for Democratic Society. That was a violent group. The Weathermen were a violent group. And then we had the Manson homicides in Hollywood. Not a pretty picture. I mean, so sociologically, people are trying to tie LSD, the LSD experience, to some of these violent acts that took place afterwards, because the Manson family was constantly high on LSD. That was a cult, and that's all you can say about that. So, there's, we have the highlights of the book. It wants to merge Western psychedelic practices with Eastern philosophies, which they use the Tibetan Book of the Dead to do so. And it may be forced and oversimplified to do this because these guys had their immediate insights, and then especially Timothy Leary probably didn't take time to synthesize the experience within himself, and he decided the whole world had to change, and he went out. He was a very reckless person. He married maybe 4 or 5 times. The relationships were not happy relationships, He went to jail for drugs. He gave the finger to the established people, and I think he became very paranoid. And I did want to mention too that the movie Dying to Know with Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, or Richard Albert, which took place at near the end of Timothy Leary's life, was very insightful, and you can get that on Prime, or you can buy it on Amazon. So the thing is, Timothy Leary, as he was nearing the end of his life, was trying to figure out what's it all about, basically. And his life was very traumatic, and he was trying to seek answers from his friend, whom he kept calling Richard Albert instead of Ram Dass. He wanted to know how he could figure out what happened to Richard Albert and what did not happen to him, because he refused to accept Ram Dass's experience with his Eastern experiences in India. That's where he met his guru, Neem Curly Baba. So they took divergent paths. Richard Albert came back, or I should say Ram Dass came back from India, gave lectures all over the country, and he was revered as a spiritual teacher. But he was not egocentric, and I do believe LSD does diminish the ego, the need to be, it's almost like the LSD experiences does touch into Buddhist philosophy, unlike most philosophies that exist. So the book itself takes you through the psychedelic experience by drawing parallels with the stages of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and it offers practical advice on navigating these altered states of consciousness and emphasizes the importance of set and setting. That's for sure. And another thing is that I found interesting, there were lots of shamanistic practices which did involve the use of psychedelic drugs years before we had psychedelics merge into our culture. And these practices by the shamans were suppressed, and we didn't really know much about these practices when we were young. They did use psychedelics for healing purposes, but our culture has always marginalized these certainly have always marginalized indigenous cultures, and this is where all of these practices emerged from. Even our indigenous American Indian culture, they used tobacco for enlightenment. And that is something that, Western science, Western medicine would never even think to include in anything that they tell their patients. So we have to have respect. We have to have respect for these substances. I do need to say, there's another one called that people use for psychedelic reasons, and it's also a cure or a healing modality for depression. They use it in controlled areas in doctors' offices, ketamines. And this is how Matthew Perry died. And you can't tell me that he didn't know what he was doing, because as it turns out, he had ketamines in his bloodstream when he died, and he was doing some very odd things before he took to the hot tub that night and drowned, or that day and drowned. So he was an interesting, and for some reason nobody wants to talk about the ketamine overdose that Matthew Perry took, otherwise known as Chandler Bing. Okay, so please see the film I just did yesterday. It's kind of come up here somewhere. And subscribe to the channel. Love to you all. Bye-bye.